Hook, a real man must be observant, he used to say, forcing me to write down the numbers daily. Yesterday there were 47, though our entire town doesn't even have 20. When I looked closer, one turned its head a full 360 degrees. Growing up in a small town in rural Montana, I thought my grandfather was just eccentric. Every morning at exactly 6 a.m., he'd wake me up with that same phrase about being observant, hand me a worn leather notebook, and send me out to count crows. Rain or shine, sick or healthy, I had to make those rounds through our neighborhood and write down every single blackbird I spotted. My friends thought it was weird. Their grandfathers taught them to fish or throw a baseball. Mine had me wandering around with a pencil, squinting at rooftops and telephone wires like some kind of amateur scientist. I'd come back with numbers that never made sense. Sometimes 3, sometimes 37, sometimes numbers that seemed impossible for such a small place. The notebook was filled with pages and pages of dates and tallies going back decades. My grandfather's handwriting got shakier as the years went on, but the routine never stopped. He'd review my counts every evening, nodding seriously as if I'd just delivered classified information. Sometimes he'd make me go back out if he thought I'd missed something. When I turned 16, I started questioning everything more. The numbers were getting ridiculous. Our town had maybe 3,000 people total, surrounded by farmland and forest. Where were all these crows coming from? I'd counted 47 yesterday, but when I really thought about it, I'd never seen more than a handful of actual crows in town during normal times. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. One of the birds on Mrs. Henderson's roof turned its head completely around while its body stayed perfectly still. No normal bird moves like that. I stood there frozen on the sidewalk, watching this thing that looked like a crow but moved like something entirely different. I ran home and confronted my grandfather. He was sitting in his favorite armchair, the one with the worn fabric that smelled like pipe tobacco and old books. When I told him what I'd seen, his face went completely pale. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, like he'd aged 10 years in 10 seconds. That night, he led me to his study, a room I'd never been allowed to enter. The walls were covered with maps, charts, and symbols I didn't recognize. Books in languages I couldn't read filled every shelf. But what caught my attention was a massive family tree drawn on the back wall, going back centuries, with names and dates and strange annotations next to each generation. He pointed to our family line and traced it back through the years. Every single man in our family had been a keeper, someone whose job was to monitor the boundaries between our world and somewhere else. The crows weren't birds at all. They were sentries from another dimension, watching and waiting for the right moment to bring their kind through. My grandfather explained that our bloodline had been chosen 300 years ago when the first crossing happened. His ancestor had made some kind of deal to keep the peace. Our family would watch and count, making sure the numbers stayed manageable, and in return, the town would remain mostly safe. But there was always a price for this protection. He showed me journals dating back generations. Each keeper had documented the same patterns, periods of calm with low numbers, then sudden spikes that meant something was coming. The entries got more desperate as the years went on. My great-great-grandfather had written about the sacrifice that must be made when the count reaches 13 on the day of choosing. I felt sick reading those old pages. Every generation, when the count hit exactly 13 on a specific day, one of the keepers had to make a choice. Either they crossed over themselves to keep the balance, or they had to send someone else in their place. The entries made it clear, someone from our bloodline always paid the price. My grandfather pulled out his most recent journal, the one I'd never seen before. His entries from the past month showed the numbers climbing steadily. 43, then 45, then 47 yesterday. He'd been tracking patterns, calculating something I didn't understand. But the final entry made my blood freeze. Today 13 crows settled on the roof. This is the sign. They're preparing for a new crossing. The boy must be ready for the sacrifice. Update 1. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those things on the rooftops, their heads spinning in ways that defied nature. I kept thinking about my grandfather's words and that terrifying journal entry. By morning, I knew I had to go out and count again, even though every instinct told me to run. The sun was just coming up when I stepped outside with the old notebook. The air felt different somehow, thicker, like before a storm, but without any clouds in the sky. I started my usual route through the neighborhood, but everything seemed wrong. The familiar houses looked slightly off, like someone had moved them a few inches while I wasn't looking. Then I saw them. Exactly 13 black shapes perched on rooftops around the town square. They weren't moving like normal birds. No preening, no shifting from foot to foot, no random head movements. They sat perfectly still, all facing the same direction. All facing me. As I got closer to count them properly, I realized they were positioned in a perfect circle around the square. Not random spots where crows might naturally land, but precise positions like they'd been placed there deliberately. I pulled out the notebook with shaking hands and started marking them down. 1, 2, 3. Each one turned to look at me as I counted it. When I reached the 13th crow, something impossible happened. They all opened their beaks at the same time, and my grandfather's voice came out. Not similar to his voice, it was exactly his voice, down to the slight rasp from years of smoking. "Time has come," they said in perfect unison. I dropped the notebook and ran home faster than I'd ever moved in my life. My grandfather was waiting for me on the front porch, but something was different about him too. His eyes had the same flat, empty look as those things on the rooftops. When he smiled at me, I noticed his teeth were too sharp. He told me to sit down, his voice unnaturally calm. The real explanation was worse than I'd imagined. Our family hadn't been chosen to be keepers, we'd been bred for it. Generation after generation, the things from the other side had been slowly changing us, making us more like them. The counting wasn't just about monitoring their numbers. It was about preparing us for the day we'd join them. Every keeper eventually crossed over, becoming one of the sentries themselves. That's why the numbers never made sense. I'd been counting not just the watchers from the other side, but also the transformed members of my own family from previous generations. My great-grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, maybe dozens of relatives I'd never known existed, all perched on rooftops and telephone wires, waiting. The real kicker was that my grandfather had died 3 months ago. What I'd been living with, what had been teaching me and preparing me, was something wearing his face. It had been mimicking him perfectly, getting me ready for this moment when the count reached 13 and I'd have to make the choice. But there was something it didn't know. While cleaning out my grandfather's real belongings after his funeral, I'd found a hidden letter addressed to me. The real grandfather had discovered what was happening to our family and had spent his final years researching a way to break the cycle. He'd found references to other families who'd escaped this fate, and he'd left me very specific instructions. The thing pretending to be my grandfather was still talking, explaining how honored I should feel to continue the family tradition. But I was barely listening anymore. My hand was already moving toward the small iron pendant my grandfather had hidden in his letter. Something he'd said would reveal the truth and give me a chance to fight back. When I pulled out the pendant, everything changed. The thing wearing my grandfather's face flickered like a bad television signal, and for a moment I could see what it really was underneath. The house around us shimmered and shifted, showing me glimpses of the real world where my grandfather's body had been found months ago, and where I'd been living alone ever since, slowly going insane. Update 2. The pendant burned hot in my palm, and suddenly I could see everything clearly for the first time in months. I wasn't in my grandfather's house. I was standing in an empty field outside town, holding conversations with thin air. The house around me dissolved like smoke, leaving me alone under the pre-dawn sky with nothing but grass and the distant lights of the real town. My mind started putting the pieces together in a way that made my stomach turn. I hadn't been living with my grandfather's replacement. I'd been completely alone since his funeral, slowly losing my grip on reality as something from the other side wormed its way into my thoughts. The counting, the impossible numbers, the conversations, all of it had been happening inside my head while my body went through the motions in the real world. But the scariest part was realizing that the delusions had been protecting me from something worse. As the fake world crumbled away, I could see the real town in the distance, and it was wrong in ways that made the hallucinations seem comforting. Every rooftop, every telephone wire, every tree was covered with those things that looked like crows but moved like predators. There had to be hundreds of them, all perfectly still, all watching me. The iron pendant was getting hotter, and I understood that my grandfather's real plan was more desperate than I'd realized. He hadn't found a way to break the cycle. He'd found a way to delay it. The pendant was keeping me anchored to the human world, but it was also broadcasting my location to everything waiting in the shadows. I started running toward town, clutching the pendant so tight it was cutting into my skin. Behind me, I could hear the sound of hundreds of wings taking flight. They weren't trying to catch me. They were hurting me, forcing me toward the town square where this whole nightmare had started. When I reached the edge of town, I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. There were people walking around, going about their morning routines, but they moved wrong. Just like the fake crows, they were too still, too coordinated, like puppets being controlled by the same strings. Every single person in town had those same flat, empty eyes. I realized with growing horror that the crossing had already happened. While I'd been trapped in my delusions, they'd replaced everyone. My neighbors, my friends, the people I'd grown up with. All gone, all wearing faces that belonged to something else. The count of 13 hadn't been a warning about what was coming. It had been a countdown to what was already over. The pendant was burning so hot now that I could smell my skin cooking, but I couldn't let go. It was the only thing keeping me human, the only thing preventing me from becoming like everything else in this place that used to be my home. But I could feel it changing me too, pulling me in directions that didn't exist, showing me glimpses of the world these things came from. That's when I discovered the truth about the keepers. We weren't guards or watchers or chosen protectors. We were bait. Our bloodline had been marked 3 centuries ago not because we were special, but because we were perfect for luring the real threats out of hiding. Every generation, when the count reached 13, it meant they'd found 13 more humans who could see through their disguises. The things wearing crow shapes weren't the invaders. They were the cleanup crew. Their job was to identify and eliminate anyone who might resist the slow, quiet takeover that had been happening for decades. Towns across the country had been falling one by one, their populations replaced so gradually that nobody noticed until it was too late. My grandfather had figured it out too late to save anyone, but he'd managed to set up one final trap. The pendant wasn't just protecting me. It was recording everything, storing proof of what had happened here. But the only way to get that information out was for me to make it to the old radio tower on the hill outside town, and I had maybe 10 minutes before the pendant burned through my hand completely. I started running again, but this time I wasn't running from the fake crows. I was running towards something much worse, the realization that this wasn't just about my town or my family. This was happening everywhere, and I might be the only person left who could warn anyone. Final update. The radio tower stood silhouetted against the dawn sky like a metal skeleton. My hand was screaming in pain from the pendant, but I could feel it doing something to my mind, opening pathways I never knew existed. As I climbed the hill, memories that weren't mine started flooding in, other keepers from other towns, all of them discovering the same terrible truth in their final moments. The pendant wasn't just for my grandfather. It was a collective memory device, passed down through a network of families who'd been fighting this invasion for generations. Each keeper who'd managed to escape the illusions had added their knowledge to it before the end. I could see flashes of other towns, other takeovers, other people running toward radio towers and cell phone arrays and internet hubs, desperately trying to get the word out. Most of them had failed. The things had learned to cut communications, to isolate their target zones before moving in. But a few messages had gotten through over the years, hidden in conspiracy forums and dismissed as fiction. Stories about people counting birds that weren't birds, about entire communities going silent overnight, about families with strange hereditary obligations that made no sense to outsiders. When I reached the base of the tower, I could see the whole town spread out below me. What I'd thought was a gradual replacement had actually happened all at once, probably months ago. The things had been maintaining the illusion of normal life just long enough to deal with me, the last potential witness. Now that I was out of the way, they could drop the pretense entirely. The town was transforming before my eyes. Buildings were shifting and flowing like liquid, rearranging themselves into structures that hurt to look at directly. The fake people were shedding their human appearances, revealing forms that belonged in nightmares. And above it all, those hundreds of crow-shaped sentries were circling in patterns that definitely weren't natural. I climbed the tower faster than should have been possible, the pendant somehow giving me strength and coordination I'd never had. At the top, there was old broadcasting equipment that my grandfather had secretly modified years ago. All I had to do was connect the pendant to the transmitter, and every memory stored inside, it would broadcast across every frequency at once. But as I made the connection, I realized the final horrible truth. The pendant hadn't been protecting me from becoming like them. It had been preparing me to become something worse. All those memories from other keepers weren't just knowledge. They were pieces of souls, fragments of everyone who'd tried to fight back. By carrying them all, I was becoming a collector myself, a repository for everything human that they wanted to erase. The broadcast went out with a pulse of energy that lit up the sky. Every radio, every television, every connected device for hundreds of miles received the same message, the complete truth about what was happening, told through the experiences of dozens of failed resistors. But I knew it wouldn't be enough. People would dismiss it as fiction, just like they always had. As I stood there on the tower, feeling the memories of the dead keepers settling into my mind permanently, I understood my real purpose. I wasn't meant to stop the invasion or save anyone. I was meant to become the witness, the one who remembers what was lost when everything familiar gets replaced by something alien wearing familiar faces. The transformation was already starting. I could feel my bones becoming hollow, my vision sharpening in ways that let me see dimensions that shouldn't exist. The pendant had burned all the way through my hand, but instead of pain, I felt a strange sense of completion. This was always how it was going to end, not with a heroic sacrifice, but with acceptance of a role I'd never wanted but couldn't escape. Down below, the fake town was dissolving entirely, revealing the staging ground it had always been. Similar operations were probably happening right now in hundreds of other small communities, each one marked by a family of keepers who thought they were protecting something when they were really just marking time until their usefulness ended. I spread my new wings and took flight, my mind now carrying the memories of everyone who'd tried to resist and failed. My job wasn't to fight anymore. It was to watch and remember, to preserve some record of what humanity had been before it became something else entirely. In a way, that made me the most human thing left in a world that was rapidly becoming something else. The sun was fully up now, and I could see other towns in the distance, still looking normal from above, but probably harboring their own secrets. Each one would have its own keeper family, its own countdown, its own final broadcast that would be dismissed as creative fiction by anyone who heard it. I flew toward the next town, knowing that my role now was to witness the end of each small community while carrying the memory of all the others. It wasn't the ending I'd hoped for, but it was the only ending that had ever been possible. The invasion had been over before it started. We just hadn't realized we were already living in the aftermath.